Robin had said that they were afraid to come out to me because I was a pastor. And I did feel hurt by that because I always felt that I was an inclusive person. So it really puzzled me. And I realized it was because of all the external messages that society perpetuates that Christians and pastors are all homophobic. But as Robin saw me reading books and having conversations with people, there was a huge change in Robin, and they became more forthcoming, more at ease. If the home environment is a safe landing spot, then the child has that support and that strength to combat anything society throws their way. I just thought, I am going to move heaven and earth to make sure that my child has a safe home. I will do my best to make sure they have a safe school environment and other environments as well. So that kind of started me on my journey of advocacy for Robin.
What do you really know about people who are born transgender? Have you ever met someone who's transgender? Well, if you're like me, you're curious but hesitant to ask questions. Well, welcome to Demystifying the Transgender Journey. In our conversations with people who were born transgender, their families, friends, and the professionals who support them, we ask probing questions and discover insightful and educational answers. You can also find more information on our website, thetransgenderjourney.com. Now let's get right into today's episode. Welcome to another episode of Demystifying the Transgender Journey. Wendy and I are so glad you're here, where we bring conversations that we're hoping open minds, touch hearts, and inspire change. These are real stories, honest conversations, and authentic voices from people who were born transgender, their families, friends, coworkers, and the healthcare professionals who are on that journey along with them. I'm Lynn Murphy, author, speaker, leadership coach, and I'm the cisgender half of this host team. Joining me is Wendy Cole, an affirmed woman, gender diversity consultant and speaker who transitioned at age 67. As we start, be sure to share this episode. Click on that subscribe button if you're on YouTube or wherever you're getting our information today. It helps others find these educational conversations and helps people get to know the truth about the transgender journey. So now, as we start this conversation, think about this. What does it look like when love asks more of us than we expected? When the roles we've held for years, whether it's spouse, parent, pastor, leader, suddenly stretch us into new understanding, new language, and sometimes new courage. Today, you'll meet Pastor Lynn, an ordained Lutheran minister for over 2 decades. Actually, she said it's almost 25 years, the mother of 2 adult transgender children, and a powerful example of someone who lives as a model of inclusion within faith communities. She's also our first pastor that we've interviewed, so we're especially delighted today. Now, her journey comes not from theory. It came from love, from learning, and from the willingness to grow when her children trusted her with who they are. So our conversation isn't just about gender identity or faith. It's about courage and choosing love in action. We explore what it means to support your child, challenge your own understanding, and have values put to the test, and how we choose to show up, even when it's uncomfortable. So get ready for a conversation that just might open your heart in a new way. So welcome, Pastor Lynn. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm just thrilled to be invited and to be here with both of you.
Well, good. Well, let's set the stage for our audience today. Just give a little bit of your background, if you will, and we'll get into some conversation about your transgender children.
Sure. So when our youngest was about 12, we knew that they had been struggling with something for a little while, and we weren't sure what. My husband and I tried to approach our youngest child in a number of different ways to try and help them. And finally, it was on the way to the first Pride Parade that both of us had been participating in that Robin had whole different colored pride flags on their face. And I asked them what they were, and then they told me what the flags represented. And at that time, I was not familiar with those terms. And I was wondering how my 12-year-old knew about those terms. And then I said, oh, is that what you are? And they said yes. So at that time, Robin came out as transgender and asexual and panromantic, I believe. So these were terms, like I'd heard the term transgender, but not the other terms. And So as a parent, the first thought I had was that this was a phase. And I tried to have conversations with them and how they came to this understanding, which I realize now was unfair for the parent to ask the child to educate them. So the first couple months, I made a lot of mistakes as a parent, but realizing that it was my job to educate myself so I could support my child, I started seeking out people in the community, organizations that represent the queer community, to learn more about, what do these terms mean? What does it mean to be transgender? And through that, I think Robin began to trust me more with more information. One of the things that puzzled me, Robin had said that they were afraid to come out to me because I was a pastor. And I did feel hurt by that because I always felt that I was an inclusive person and I felt I had talked in a way that was inclusive. And also my father, he passed away a couple of years ago at age 87. It was confirmed to me that my dad was gay. My parents separated when I was 15. And 15 years later, when I was 30, my dad came out to me. I was the first of the four of us kids that dad came out to. When it was age appropriate to share this with my children, I did. I was very open about that. My dad lived his life in the closet, and I felt badly for my dad that he felt he had to live that way. So even at age 87, he still lived in the closet. So I'm outing him now that he's passed away. So it really puzzled me that, my kids knew that grandpa was gay. We loved grandpa. We visited grandpa every chance we could. We had a good relationship with grandpa. So it really puzzled me that Robin was hesitant to come out to me. And I realized it was because of all the external messages that society perpetuates, that Christians and pastors are all homophobic. So there is that level of fear in Robin. But as Robin saw me reading books and having conversations with people, connecting them with youth groups, then there's a huge change in Robin, and they became more forthcoming, more at ease. And one of the things I read in a book called The Transgender Child, a handbook for families and professionals, there's a sentence in there that hugely impacted me, and it talked about statistics about transgender children, youth, adults, mental health concerns. And this particular quote talked about how transgender children, those that do the best are the ones that have the most supportive families. Because if the home environment is a safe landing spot, then the child has that support and that strength to combat anything society throws their way. So when I read that sentence in the book, I just thought, I am going to move heaven and earth to make sure that my child has a safe home, and I will do my best to make sure they have a safe school environment and other environments as well. So that kind of started me on my journey of advocacy for Robin.
So Robin was assigned female at birth.
Correct, yes.
Okay, and you're using they pronouns?
Correct. So part of their journey was a journey of discovery of their gender, and watching this unfold in their life also made me realize that gender is not straightforward for everybody. So Robin understood that external female identity was something that did not fit for them. And at first they thought it was transgender male. But once we supported them in gender-affirming surgery and hormone replacement therapy, Robin realized that genderqueer or non-binary was the identity that fit for them. The external messages of our culture and society are not helpful in helping people identify their gender that doesn't automatically fit with the body parts or the external appearance.
So
Exactly.
how do you and Robin define non-binary? Let's educate our audience here and educate me.
Yeah. Yeah. So Robin does not feel that a female identity or a male identity fits for them. And then like the hormone replacement treatment and the gender affirming surgeries have better allowed them to feel that their body fits for them. So neither male nor female, their gender expression is very diverse. So sometimes they may dress in a way that we might say a woman would dress, and sometimes they dress in a way that we might say a man would dress, and sometimes it's a mixture of both. But they're, anyway, yeah. So non-binary is not feeling like a male identity or the female identity is the fit.
And it sounds like you're very accepting of that. Before they came out, did you know much about transgender journey, or had you known any people who were transgender?
Only one. I knew very little. A friend's parent had come out as the opposite gender as what they had appeared. And that was, I wasn't part of that when that parent came out, but I kind of learned of the impact on the family. But the family was accepting and supportive of this parent that came out. So this person that came out was very, I would say they were in their 50s or 60s, maybe 50s when, yeah.
So not a young person. So what were your thoughts before your children came out to you, as far as your thoughts or beliefs, especially since you're a pastor and Robin was concerned about pastors being totally against this?
Yeah, like outwardly accepting, but inwardly questioning, right? Like inwardly, this doesn't make sense to me, but I'm still going to accept them and treat them like I would treat anybody else. And then for that reason, because there's a lot of kind of inner questioning about that, that's when the reading came in. Because I mean, I did hold some stereotypes and you know, when it came to Robin coming out, some doubt, like not convinced initially that this was like a, well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I thought maybe it was something that they were doing to get attention, or maybe just something that they're exploring for the fun of it. But
well, a lot of people say, oh, you know, this is just a phase, or like you're saying. I've heard people say, oh, they're just doing it to get attention.
Yeah.
How did you reconcile that?
Just, I realized that I needed to, even if I wasn't inwardly 100% on board or understanding, that outwardly I had to express that so that Robin would feel safe and accepted. And again, realizing that it was my responsibility to educate myself and not my 12-year-old's responsibility to educate me. So, you know, I kept reading, I kept talking to people. It was very important for me to engage Robin in youth groups with other gender and sexually diverse youth. So I connected with the leaders of those groups and I learned from them, like just by, you know, some of the stories they shared, but also just getting to know them. And then there is a gay club in the city where we live that's run by volunteers. And it was important for me to connect Robin with that club and to make sure that I supported that club as a person, to make sure that that would continue going so that they're safe places for Robin to go. And yeah, so we were invited to an all ages event. So I took Robin there, connected them with people there. And then to this day, you know, 8 years later, Robin is really, really involved in that club, like one of 3 people that has been named or crowned, like to organize events at this club. Now that they're 20, they're of age to do that. So
you're seeing the benefit of getting support and having representation. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. For Robin, connecting with youth and adults in the queer community was instrumental. So connecting with people who get it, and then that's part of the safe place, safe space, and not having to defend who you are, explain who you are, and just be with people who get it.
Well, and you talk about doing so many things right, correctly, affirming your child. So for parents out there, what were some of the mistakes that you made and what did you learn from those? Because I think parents are struggling. Parents are confused, like you. They didn't really see this coming or know what was going on. So
Yeah.
what can you share with parents about the mistakes you made?
Yeah, that's a good question because one of them was doubting their chosen name and questioning them choosing their name. And I laid a guilt trip on them for not, yeah, that my intention wasn't to do that, but, or maybe it was, but I laid a guilt trip on them, explaining to them why we named them what we did and why that name was important to us. But yeah, that was a huge mistake because it just added to their own guilt or confusion. Yeah, we came to the conclusion that we needed to embrace their name and use their name. And the pronouns were also hard at first to use the different pronouns. And we got used to that. But the mistakes were, yeah, doubting them, guilt tripping them about the name change, how questioning how they had come to this conclusion. I think those are probably the biggest mistakes.
Yeah, and what most parents don't realize is their child is actually born this way. Everything about gender is formed in the brain in utero.
Mm-hmm.
And so they knew at a very early age how they felt. And then they told you that they were afraid to tell you because you were a pastor and because of what society said. That's the socialization aspect that absolutely lets us know we're not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And when you started doubting their name and you just laid on all of that. And that's a big mistake that a lot of parents made. Mine made it incredibly. I'm still dealing with getting past all of that.
Wow.
And until they actually start to live as themselves, that feeling of safety and all of that doesn't happen. And for someone who's a parent, they really do need to embrace and understand that even though for them, as you said, it didn't make sense, it's not part of your world. And this is the mistake that a lot of parents make right up front.
Yeah. Yeah. And I saw it quite a bit too with Robin's friends, because many of their friends were gender diverse and wanting to go, having different pronouns, changing their names. And often a parent would drop off their child or pick up their child at our house or their teenager and use the child's dead name or pronouns from birth. And I would just, after I had experienced that learning and understood how damaging that could be, I was, in talking to the parent, I would always use their child's chosen name and pronouns.
Right.
Even though the parent would always use the dead name and the previous pronouns. But I'd try to model that.
One of the biggest things that happens with transgender people, myself included, is if your parents and your family is not accepting you, then you can't accept yourself.
Yeah.
And that just spirals into a lot of psychological issues and fear and doubts and fears of rejection and everything. It's amazing when we talk to a parent who raised their child with more of a gender-free spirit and let them explore. They don't go through all that trauma.
Yeah.
And they don't have any of the issues. And by the time they get to being a young adults, they totally accept themselves for who they are.
Yeah. And that reminds me of a great story. So Robin actually also has gotten into the drag community in the city where we live. And that's kind of an interesting story in itself. But anyway, we ended up shortly after Robin was getting involved in the drag community. And I was meeting people in the drag community in the city where we live. And one of our favorite drag queens was having a drag queen story time at our local library. So Robin and I went and delighted to see, I think Robin was maybe 15 at the time. So Robin was the oldest young person there. Parents mostly had their little kids. But the stories that the drag queens were reading were all like really inclusive stories, right? About two moms, two dads, about kids who dress in different gender expressions. And I remember leaning over to Rob and saying, I wish I knew about these books when you were younger. And Robin said, I wish you did too. And that just reinforced to me that as parents, like the influence we have, and as inclusive as I thought I was, as a parent, I could have done better. I could have done more. And realizing that just saying things isn't enough. But, if I'd known about those books and read more inclusive books, and yeah.
I never use the word understand when I'm talking to a cisgender person, especially a parent. I do not expect them to understand. There's no reason why they would comprehend this. It's not part of our culture. And so don't beat yourself up for not knowing, because you were never exposed to it.
Do you think Robin knew early on that they were different?
I'm not sure, because like when I think about the clothes and the toys that they chose to wear, they were more aligned with their gender at birth. It was more when puberty struck that I think that was when Robin experienced the heightened gender dysphoria.
So what happened at puberty?
Well, they grew breasts and got a period, which, and then that heightened, escalated the gender dysphoria, that this appearance and this thing happening in my body does not fit with who I know myself to be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you have trouble getting gender-affirming care then for Robin?
No, because we have an excellent family doctor. I think that was one of the key things. And because I was prepared to advocate for Robin. And so when we mentioned this to the family doctor sent in a referral. And in Robin's case, the timing was good in that a newer doctor starting a gender affirming practice had just kind of started in the city we live in. So there wasn't a huge waiting list for Robin to start the gender affirming care.
Did they have to see a therapist or just a doctor, or what?
I mean, they did see a psychiatrist for other reasons, but they did not need a psychiatrist's approval to receive the gender affirming care.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you talk about that, seeing some of these other kids, mothers who dead name their children and that type of thing. In your observation, did you see any difference between the children who were affirmed by their parents and the children who were not? What did you observe there?
The children who had supportive and affirming parents were more mentally stable or had fewer mental health issues. I think that's probably the best way to say it, because I think mental health issues just come as part and parcel when your external appearance does not match your internal, according to society, according to your internal understanding of that. And one of the differences I saw too was, and it's not cut and dried, but like I know I understood and was curious and accessing information, like reading books, going to workshops, talking with people. And I realized not everybody has those like social skills or educational skills to seek that information out. So I saw a difference. So some families, don't necessarily know where to go or who to turn to, or don't know that there's options out there, or don't understand that you can seek out those supports and that information.
Well, and then let's talk about your other child.
Okay. Yeah.
So Emily is the older of the two, a couple years older than Robin. And are willing to share Emily's story with us?
Yeah, Emily is much more private, so I will probably share less of her story. So she was 19 when she came out, and I think it was more of a surprise because I think statistically, what are the odds of having two transgender children? And also there was, on my part as a parent, there is again is this attention seeking? Because, Robin had received so much support and attention from my husband and I during this journey. Not that I hope we didn't neglect Emily. She might tell you otherwise. I don't know. But it's like I had never, besides Emily wearing my shoes when she was 2 or 3, I hadn't seen any manifestation of what we would call stereotypically female, like dressing or activities. So in some ways it was tougher because, again, not expecting it, but in other ways we had the resources and access to information to, again, get her the gender affirming care that she wanted. And we'd been through one name change with Robin, so we helped out Emily with her paperwork to get that done, the name change and the gender marker change. And then we made sure she got a referral to a gender affirming doctor, and she also didn't have to wait very long, thankfully. And tried to support her in the same level as Robin in things like giving her a clothing allowance to purchase some clothes that she wanted. And, if her bedding looked more masculine, I'll buy you bedding of your choice, and things I had done for Robin so that, the bedroom decor and the wardrobe was more in line with their tastes and their preferences.
Was she in college at the time?
Yeah, she was in university, and her request to us was that she kind of spend the year like outwardly transitioning. She'd already been growing her hair, but with the hormone replacement therapy, her body shape changed a bit. And so at home, she was known as Emily, but outwardly, she was still known from her previous name. And then about a year later, when she had physically transitioned more, she came out more publicly, and then she gave us permission, like my husband and I, to speak about it more publicly. And then the thing about being a pastor is people are always asking about your kids. And the congregation that I served previously, I served a different congregation for 17 years. When Robin first came out, all I experienced was acceptance of that. And I was very proud of the congregation for that reason. So they first came out as trans male, and then a few years later, they came out as non-binary or genderqueer, is how they termed it. And then the they, them pronouns went along with that. And I think that was more challenging for people, although no one said anything to me directly. But then when Emily came out, and people would ask me about my kids, I would generally refer to her as my oldest, because I thought for some of these church folks, it's just going to be too much for them. And I knew that there'd be people judging me and judging my parenting, having my kids like doubting their gender or whatever. But I thought, I can't control what other people are thinking. All I can control is, my attitude towards my kids and my love for them. And I'm not ashamed of my kids. I'm proud of my kids. But there was someone from the congregation who even though she outwardly would call herself an ally and say that she was supportive, she was saying different things here and there that I realized, even though she thinks she's an ally and she thinks she's inclusive, she isn't. And she did ask me a direct question about Emily, because we weren't public about it at the time, because she'd noticed Emily's appearance was changing on the Facebook photos I was posting. And so she asked me a direct question, so I answered it. And I said, yes, our oldest child has been transitioning to female. This is her new name. And then I also was honest in saying, it's very exhausting, like constantly telling people, educating them about these gender transitions. And then her response to me was, you're wise to keep this to yourself. You only need to share it with people that need to know, and not everybody needs to know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
See, you understand, the both
Oh,
of you
yeah.
understand how inappropriate that is. And
Yes.
I just thought, she is telling me to keep my kid in the closet because it not only makes other people uncomfortable, but clearly her.
Mhm.
And that was just one of many, what I will call microaggressions, that I started to experience from different people in that congregation, that made me realize this congregation is not as inclusive and accepting as I once thought. And then they eventually made a series of decisions that I didn't agree with, and one was not in the spirit of inclusivity. And I just realized I cannot, in good conscience, serve this congregation anymore, because they are not making decisions that are supportive of my kids and their journey. So anyway, and then so I left that congregation, and I'm now serving a congregation who is, in Lutheran circles, the congregation is known as a Reconciling in Christ congregation. So this particular church has done the education and the work to be intentionally inclusive of gender diversity and sexual diversity.
That's wonderful. You found a home where you fit and where your children fit.
Yes, yes.
So are your concerns for Emily different than your concerns for Robin?
In some ways, well, I mean, given that we still live in a world or a society that can be sexist, I believe that it's a challenging world for transgender people, and likely a more challenging world for transgender women, because of the sexism against women, and that still exists, and then the transphobia that also is out there. So, and personality wise, Emily she's a quieter person. It's harder for her to make friends. She's more comfortable at home in her bedroom playing video games with her friends online. Robin is one that's more going out, getting involved in the community, and has that support of the queer community. And yeah, so I have a few more concerns.
There is something that I've observed within the community, especially with the trans feminine.
Mm-hmm.
Because of society, there's a very strong tendency not to integrate into society, but rather cling together and stay in small groups and all of that. But what I've found is going out, putting myself out, meeting people.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of people don't really understand us. And that's why they have that feeling. And the more of us that I believe that can get out and integrate and be part of society and just have cisgender friends,
Yeah.
the better off we're all going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because once people get to know us, they find out that we're really human, just like everybody else, strangely.
So how have you and your husband equipped the kids to handle some of these things that they're likely going to encounter, or maybe have already encountered in society?
Like offering that stable, positive home environment. We go to protests together. So there's a pronoun policy controversy in the province we live in. And as a family, we went to the protest. We've encouraged them to seek counseling, and we make sure that that's available and funded for them. And encouraging for both of them, like Robin was more interested in engaging in the queer community where we live. Emily, not so much. When I go to different events, I invite her to come with me. I think she's only ever come once to an event with the queer community, but I continue to offer those invitations to her to allow her, opportunity to connect with other people. And and encouraging and advocating for their gender affirming hormone treatment and surgeries that they're interested in having, like have had and are interested in having.
Hmm. So speaking about society and going out in society and with all the laws, I don't know what's going on in Canada, but in the United States here, we have these horrendous bathroom laws. Have either of your children had any issues with, just performing bodily functions. It's just such a ridiculous thing to me, but
Yeah. So with Robin, so one of the interesting things when we first advocated, like when Robin first came out, and it was just before the school year, and I let the administration know that this was happening. So we were able to meet before the school year started and, talk about kind of a strategy plan because Robin's classmates would know Robin as a different name, different gender. How do we do this? And they had conversations with Robin also, which I appreciated. What would you like to see happen? We also talked about bathroom use, but this was like I had the first meeting with the administration, it was just me. And then the second meeting was with me and Robin and the teacher and probably the principal. And the bathroom use came up in the meeting before that was just with me. And the superintendent of that particular school system said that according to the human rights law, Robin was entitled to use any bathroom they wanted. And I said, oh, I can't imagine Robin would be comfortable using the boys' bathroom, but there was some genderless or gender neutral, like single bathrooms. And so we discussed, without consulting with Robin, that those are the bathrooms Robin would use. Because I assumed, but didn't ask. It was actually years later that Robin brought this up and said that they weren't allowed to use the boys' bathroom. And I said, we had that conversation without you. And I said, I assumed that you wouldn't want to use the boys' bathroom. So anyway, that was a learning moment. Unfortunately, it was a couple of years after the fact. They'd gone to a different school at that point. So that was, interesting for me to learn. And then Robin went to a Bible camp that like our family, like my husband had been involved in for decades. And we felt for the most part that they were inclusive and we had a proactive conversation the first year that Robin attended the camp as their different gender. We had a proactive conversation and it was mutually agreed, like with Robin and my husband and I on the camp, that Robin wouldn't stay in the male or female cabins, that Robin would stay with staff or counselors, which happens on occasion for other reasons, and that Robin would use a different bathroom and shower. And that was mutually agreed upon, and that worked well. And then the acting executive director also had a follow-up conversation to ask us how the camp went, and it was good. Like we'd talk to Robin, and Robin didn't have any concerns. But the following year, there was a different executive director. There was no proactive conversation, and we thought because things had gone so well the previous year, there was nothing to discuss. Well, that second year that Robin went, and this was before they came out as genderqueer, so they were trans male, they weren't allowed in the boys' camping area, whereas before they were allowed in the area, but not in the cabins. Well, it felt like they were tightening things up, like getting more legalistic about this. And then there was certain bathrooms that Robin was allowed to use and bathrooms they weren't allowed to use. And sometimes a bathroom that they were told to use was locked, which meant that by the time they found someone with a key, then there's some serious biological concerns that are going on, right? Anyway, we had a follow-up conversation with the executive director, and they had misremembered from the year before that Robin had been allowed in the boys' area. They had misremembered and thought that Robin wasn't allowed in the boys' area. Robin was not allowed in the boys' cabin. And I guess the sad thing about that was, even though we sat down to have a civil conversation, it didn't sound like there was much room for compromise. And Robin left camp that year feeling quite discriminated against because of the restricted bathroom use and the restricted ability to go into the boys' cabin area. And when I talked to the executive director and the assistant, I offered resources that they could read, workshops that they could attend that could maybe help them understand this better. And the messaging I kept receiving was basically, if we do any of this education, this is going to look like we approve of this. It's not what they said, but part of it, there is a very conservative element to that camp. And like in the end, even though our family had a 30-year connection with that camp, we've cut ties. And for some reason, they can get away with calling themselves an inclusive camp. So yeah, so then that's Robin's story with bathrooms. With Emily, as she was transitioning, we did go on a vacation and we were on a cruise ship, and Emily hadn't physically like her physical transition wasn't as convincing yet as she had hoped. So even though I think she probably could have used the female bathrooms on this cruise ship, she chose not to. So she chose to always go back to our cabin to go to the bathroom, which is kind of problematic. If you're on deck 10 and you have to go to the bathroom, then you have to go to deck like 6 to where our cabin is or whatever. And that just really made me feel for Emily, because I just said, this should probably be okay. And it was interesting that the servers, when we'd go to the restaurants on the cruise ship, some would call her ma'am, some would call her Mr. So, I mean, I guess it's just an example of her transition not being as complete as she wanted it,
One of the things along with that is when we first start, we're not comfortable with ourselves. And we are not accepting of ourselves quite as much as we need to be, and that's what people pick up on. I tell people that I've worked with, you have about 2 seconds. Everybody makes a snap judgment as to what your gender identity is, period. And it's up to you not to confuse them. So if we're not confident and really totally accepting of ourselves for who we are, we give off an energy and little cues that indicate, yeah, there's a little something different here. And then the person, like the server, will notice and come back and make an adjustment to their gender and use the male instead of the female.
Interesting.
So the more we get into it and the more we get comfortable with ourselves and basically, not really particularly care what people think and just be. Once I started doing that, I never got misgendered again.
Wow.
I also never, ever went into the men's room as I was presenting female. Never. I just automatically went in there. And what I learned in New York City was always act like you belong.
Well, I love your story about the 2 years at camp, because it illustrates there's a way to do it that works for everybody, which they did the first year. Have these conversations, have open conversations, including the child, including the person. And then there's a way not to do it by making assumptions. So I think that's a lesson for people who are listening to this too, to say,
for sure,
ways to do that. So as a pastor, how have you shown up differently as a pastor now that you have children who have transitioned?
Just learning from both the kids, actually, not just Robin. Like I talked about how Robin was, worried about coming out to us because I was a pastor. There had been other conversations at the supper table when the kids had said, oh, Christians are homophobic, like anti-homosexual. And I'm like, where are you getting that information from? Because that is not anything that my husband and I ever, shared in conversation. And in fact, when the previous church I served, like the national church in 2011 or 2012 had made the decision to bless same-sex unions, ordain sexually and gender diverse people. And so the national church had made that decision in 2012 at national convention. It was passed. And then it was up to congregations to make their own decisions, congregations and pastors. So when the previous church I served was going through these conversations, the church did eventually vote to bless same-sex unions. But my husband and I all often have conversations around this. We weren't hiding these conversations from the kids, right? And so it's very curious to me that the kids still felt this, that churches were homophobic. And I said, where do you get this information? Because you're not getting it from me. You're not getting it from your dad. You're not getting it from, like at that time, the church I served, because the microaggressions came later. And they said, well, that's what social media says. Right. So I realized not only the church needed to do a better job in general, but me as a person needed to do a better job, not just talking, but doing things that showed my inclusivity. And what I realized too, as my kids came out, I'd be thinking, like, unless somebody intentionally said something, as in, doesn't matter to us what gender your kid is or whatever, if people don't say anything, how are you going to know, right? So it just made me realize that I needed to speak up more and be out there more in terms of advocacy. Mm-hmm. So before Robin came out, like that was the first Pride parade that we had ever attended or watched. So, and then we haven't obviously missed one since, but I thought if we had been going to Pride parades as a family, before now, then there would be this better sense that, oh, mom and dad are okay with this, right? And then even, speaking about it. So, so occasionally in sermons, I would mention the importance of inclusion, or in my newsletter articles at church, I would mention it. I mentioned like taking Robin to the queer club in the city we live in. And, I renewed my membership at that club year after year. So I show up there so that people in the community know I'm inclusive. And then a couple years ago, I was invited to participate in a fundraiser for a home for 2S LGBTQ youth in the city that doesn't qualify for government funding. So all the funding is donated. So I was invited to participate. It was called a celebrity drag show. So it was an incredibly fun event. Anyway, looking back, I realized I was public about my involvement in the church I served at the time. And some people in the church did support me financially in my fundraising. But it was interesting that 9 months later was when I started hearing the negative comments about my involvement. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Like, there's nothing at the time, but then the person who brought it up, I thought, why do you feel this is important to bring up 9 months after the event? But in any case, it was a very public way for me to, as a pastor, show support in the city I live for the 2S LGBTQ community. And so I'm much more like visible in my support, much more vocal in my support, and realize how important that is. Whereas I don't think I realized that before.
What it sounds like to me is you're talking about a coming out process for the family, for you as a pastor, for you as a parent, that, there have been the phases of your coming out as parents of transgender children. And I think that's something that parents need to think about too. I don't know if that concept has come up before in our conversations, but it just seems to me like something to be aware of is how the family comes out.
Stated that the only way to transition and stay with people in your lives is if your family and your friends transition with you. Mm-hmm. That's key, because if it doesn't work, it's not beneficial for us who transitioned to even stay around you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because all we're getting is unacceptable vibes.
Right.
It all has to do with society and
Yeah.
social norms and what people believe. And the
Yeah.
thing of it is their beliefs are fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
They're not supported in biology, neurology, or anything about science.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did Emily respond when Robin came out?
That's a very interesting question, because when Robin came out, it was very much an embracing of their gayness and their transness. So lots of trans flags, lots of gay flags, like rainbow flags. So in their bedroom, t-shirts, buttons, and Emily was actually quite disdainful of it. And I think that was probably part of Emily's struggle in figuring out her own identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so the interesting thing about that is now Emily is the one that has a trans flag and a lesbian flag in her bedroom.
And how does Robin handle that?
Well, and Robin's fine with it. Like they've had a conflicted relationship as teenagers, which always kind of made me sad because there's four in my family and my parents didn't really cultivate a closeness in our family. So it was really important to me as a mom to cultivate as best I could a closeness in our family and between my two kids. Um, but now that they're 20 and 22, like they have been relating and getting along well in the last couple years. Yeah, so that's been really gratifying to see.
It's nice to see. And there's a question I want to ask to Pastor Lynn.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Does the Bible really denigrate people who are homosexual or people who are gender fluid? Are there the things in the Bible that people are saying that vilify people who are gender diverse?
That's a great question.
I thought of that myself.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple things I'll say about that. People can find evidence for any belief they want in the Bible when you proof text, when you take a verse out of context. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, the Bible is full of contradictions because it was a Bible that was written over about 1,500 years by many different people. So there is a great documentary out there called 1946, The Mistranslation of the Bible That Shifted Culture, or something like that. 1946, The Mistranslation of the Bible That Shifted Culture. And it talks about how there is a version of the Bible that was created in 1946 that took the word Malakoi and decided to, this was in the New Testament in Romans, I believe, and decided to translate that word as homosexual when homosexual was not an accurate translation. The accurate translation was pedophile. So
we have those too.
Certainly we can all agree that pedophilia is wrong. In this documentary, it talks about how the texts of the Bible that are existing, like the most original texts that are out there, are in Hebrew or Greek. Old Testament, primarily Hebrew, New Testament, primarily Greek, bit of Aramaic thrown in there. So this particular translation, there was a committee that made the decision to translate Malakoi as homosexual. And there was somebody who wrote to the translation committee and said, I actually don't think that that's an accurate translation. I think that based on this and this scholarly evidence, that that word means pedophile. This was the RSV version, the Revised Standard Version of 1946. So it was unfortunate that that decision was made to use the mistranslation of that word, because other Bibles following this translation, like other translations of the Bible, use this 1946 version rather than going back to the scholarly translations or doing their own scholarly translations. So that's why the documentary is called what it is, because this mistranslation of this word in 1946 literally shifted culture to translate this particular verse as homosexuality being wrong. And using the word homosexual was a mistranslation. So the other thing I will say is that as Lutherans, and it's not just as Lutherans, but when we look at the Bible, we recognize that the best way to read the Bible is through the lens of Jesus. As Christians, we're followers of Jesus, and when we look at what Jesus said, how Jesus lived, what Jesus taught, Jesus didn't say anything about people who are transgender or people who are attracted to people of their same gender. Jesus said nothing about that.
Right.
But Jesus said a whole lot about being loving, being accepting, being inclusive. And Jesus was all about being with people on the margins of society, supporting the most vulnerable, and returning them to community so that they would be accepted in community. So as Lutherans, we talk about reading the Bible through the lens of Jesus. We look at everything through a perspective. So we look at reading the Bible through the lens or the perspective of Jesus, which means we read the Bible with the lens of love and inclusion and acceptance. And how do we accept and support people who are vulnerable and marginalized? So what that means is that there's going to be things that are more important in the Bible and things that are less important in the Bible. So you look at the teachings in Leviticus, all the don't mix different fabrics, don't eat shellfish, don't lay with a woman, who's on her cycle. That stuff is less important because it doesn't point to Jesus. So there's stuff that's more important, stuff that's less important. And also there's contradictions. I mean, there's patriarchy, there's domination, there's ethnocentrism in the Bible, and Jesus was not about any of that. So, I mean, in Ezra Nehemiah, you've got Ezra Nehemiah saying, divorce your foreign wives. Well, Jesus would never say that. So the importance when reading the Bible is to look at the big picture of the Bible, which is about God desiring to heal this broken world and Jesus coming and modeling for us how we could heal this broken world by living as he lives. And the Old Testament is all about people screwing that up and again and again and again. So those are a couple of key things. And also when it comes to diversity, a very key teaching for me is for many, many years, I understood that sexuality was on a spectrum. You've got, sexuality in terms of heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, and then anything in between. So I personally had this understanding of sexuality on a spectrum for many decades and hadn't ever thought about gender being on a spectrum until, my kids started on this journey. And, when you think about men, well, there's some masculine men and some more what we might say effeminate men. So for women, I mean, stereotypically we talk about the girly girls or the tomboys. Mm-hmm. So within a gender, we have this huge spectrum. Mm-hmm. So why not have that whole spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, Robin being non-binary, somewhere in the middle. And then some people do identify themselves outside the gender binary as well. In the Bible, people might quote Genesis. Well, God made male and female. Well, it's the book of Genesis isn't a scientific workbook. It's the creation story is not telling us how. The creation story is telling us who. And we hear God made night and day, but we know that there's this 24-hour spectrum, right? There's dawn and dusk. When does dawn start? When does dawn end? When does dusk start? So, night and day, dawn and dusk, that's a whole spectrum. So
absolutely nothing is absolute.
Exactly. Exactly. The Bible isn't telling us about these binaries. There's that recognition that there's this whole spectrum along the binary. So that really helped me understand gender expression and gender identity a lot better, is understanding that gender can also be viewed on the spectrum. And the Bible supports that. Even though we hear day and night, we know that there's this whole range in between. So
I really like that example.
yeah. And also there's several instances in the Bible where it talks about eunuchs. Eunuchs were considered to be a third gender, and eunuchs could easily move among gendered spaces, male spaces, female spaces. There's a verse in Isaiah, I don't know if it's Isaiah 53, 56, 58, when the eunuchs are being referred to, and it says something like, I will make you better than sons and daughters. And this quote comes from a book called Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians by Austin Harkey, who is a Lutheran transgender male. And it's funny, these verses that, I probably read that verse countless times, but until Austin Harkey pointed that out, it wasn't something that I had paid any attention to. Isaiah 56, verses 3-8. I'm just going to quickly look it up here.
So you've learned that gender is a spectrum.
Yes.
And you've also learned that it's not absolute. And the other thing that people need to learn is that sex and gender are not synonymous terms.
Yes.
I have encountered so many intelligent, professional, business people, everything, that for sex and gender is synonymous, interchangeable words, and they're not. And I always tell them, gender's between the ears, sex is between the legs.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And then when you think about the spectrum of sexuality and the spectrum of gender, then there's all sorts of different combinations.
Think about the gay man who is very effeminate. That happened in utero. And it's a very natural feeling. It's how they act. That's who they are.
Yeah.
This is just fascinating. Did you want to read that?
I'm sorry.
Yes. So Isaiah chapter 56, verse 3-8. Do not let the foreigner joined to God say, God will surely separate me from God's people. And do not let the eunuch say, I'm just a dry tree. For thus says God to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off.
Well, and that's Old Testament. That's not even New Testament. Interesting.
So, talking about God's inclusive love. God loves all.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the lesson. I've always wanted to dig into that with someone who's a biblical scholar, and thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much. Yes.
So let's just talk about your life. I've got just a couple questions I want to ask you.
Sure.
What is it that surprises you most about your life?
Oh, that's kind of a broad question. Can you
Yes,
narrow
I know.
Okay. I guess what I can say is, as I have embraced this journey of learning and education and being more inclusive, and I view it as a call, like God calling me through my experience with my kids to learn more, to be more vocal, to educate others, to be a more active advocate. Before Robin came out, I don't think I ever would have seen myself as being a vocal and visible advocate. But I really feel it's been God's call in my life, and God has led me to people and to resources, and God has given me the confidence and the voice to speak out. This celebrity drag show I mentioned doing drag in front of 700 people and raising $24,000. I never would have dreamed that a couple of years before, that I would have the confidence to do that and the desire to do that. And then as I learned more about what people in vulnerable and marginalized communities deal with, I have become more aware of my white cisgender privilege. And I also have realized what I saw as more and more people from the queer community would send me friend requests on Facebook, like a lot through this celebrity drag show I was involved in. What I saw on their Facebook feeds was that the people who are part of the gender and sexually diverse community were also very involved and educated advocates of Indigenous people. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I was participating in a walk that was advocating for Indigenous people. And I saw a lot of people from, a lot of my friends from the queer community there. Looked around, didn't see anybody from the church community I knew, like no other clergy, and not just clergy from my denomination that I'm part of, but I know clergy from many other denominations because I've been in the city for so long. Didn't see any church people, like from the church I was serving or other churches, but I saw the queer community showing up for the Indigenous community. And that also made me aware of my white cisgender privilege and how marginalized people show up for other marginalized people because they understand the need for that. And then that just also led me on a journey towards learning more about anti-racism. And so I've taken some workshops on that. And so what has surprised me about my life is that I never would have thought this was in my future, say 10 years ago, before Robin came out. But with Robin coming out, I often describe it as cracking my mind, heart wide open to what vulnerable and marginalized communities. I'm getting a sense, I don't have the whole picture. I mean, I experienced a bit of sexism within the church and some, marginalization because of that. But I mean, that's minor compared to what Indigenous people deal with, people of color deal with, transgender people deal with. So it has just surprised me that this has been a passion, but also I've been surprised by how God has been using that. And the context I'm in now, I serve in a building that has 2 different churches in it. And we also rent space to a psychologist and a massage therapist. And we also rent space to an organization of African descent that works towards systemic racism. So I'm like, this has, been an interest of mine. And I just feel I'm absolutely in the right place, serving in a building that both churches are affirming of the 2S LGBTQ community. And there's just such diversity in this building. So that has surprised me. I never would have saw myself here doing this and being interested in all these things and advocating for all these things had it not been for my kids coming out and just starting on that learning journey.
And as you transitioned with them, you evolved.
Yes. Yeah.
What a wonderful surprise.
Yes.
It sounds to me like your life is so much richer in different ways than you expected.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Lynn, that's just wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Any last words, any words of wisdom you want to share with parents or just society in general?
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to what you said, Lynn, about coming out and the parents coming out, because that was very, very insightful. It very much is a coming out of the parents as well. And for every time our kids have come out, like I have also needed to come out with their new identity, right? And their new name and their new pronouns and educating and sharing. And I also realize as a parent how I come out with that information sends a message. And when I come out with that information with love and confidence and respect for my children, then it's better received than if I'm, timid about it or hiding it, or which was challenging with Emily's situation because she didn't want us to share that right away. But I didn't want, if I'm talking about her, I didn't want to share her dead name that she wasn't using at home. So there is a coming out definitely for parents, for family members, as we share that information with different people. We have an opportunity to model that when we do that. The other side of that coin is that it is exhausting. It's exhausting to continue like educating and sharing people, and so just as a parent coming out with that information and then multiple times with multiple kids, that just gives me an inkling of what a transgender person themselves goes through as transgender people continue to come out and educate, and in some cases having to defend who they are and their identity. And so that's, given me a huge insight into that for sure.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's wonderful to share that with parents and share that with our audience. So, and thank you so much for this. Wendy, did you have anything to as we wind up today?
As you said, it's exhausting. It's even more so on the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
And family and parents need the transition with their kids. Otherwise, it's not going to work out. That's all there is to it.
Much more difficult.
And you've spared your kids the trauma of rejection.
Yeah. And then one last thing I'd like to add is that one of the key learnings for me through all this is that I don't care what genders my kids are. I'm not invested in their genders. What I most care about is having a good relationship with my kids, and being a person that my kids can come to and know that they will be loved and accepted for who they are, regardless of their gender or sexuality.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being such a loving parent and a loving Christian. Really appreciate that. If people want to contact you, how would you like them to do that?
If they could do that through you, and then, if you're willing to screen that information on my behalf.
Absolutely. We'd be happy to do that. Oh, this has just been remarkable today. And so as we're wrapping up this conversation with Pastor Lynn today, we're left with something that's really deeper than answers. We're really left with an invitation to examine what we've been taught, to notice where our own fears and our own misunderstandings still live, and to ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to lead with love? Lynn's journey reminds us that growth doesn't really happen all at once. It unfolds in conversations, in mistakes, as she talked about. She made mistakes. She learned from mistakes. In moments where you show up with courage, even when it doesn't feel good. We've often heard that parents and partners feel hurt when their loved ones transition, but don't fully explain what's going on with them. And Lynn talks about how it's not the child's job to educate the parent or a marginalized person's job to carry the weight of someone else's understanding. It's really up to each of us to do as Lynn has done, to stay curious, to learn, and to be kind enough to listen, to ask questions and to listen. And perhaps most powerfully, she challenges us to think about faith, not as a label, but as a practice. She talks about what we can do and how we can do that. So it's not just what we believe or we say we believe, it's how we show up. So here's the thing to carry with you as you leave this episode today. If love, dignity, respect, and compassion are at the core values that you claim, they're your core values, where in your life is there an opportunity to live those values, to be more bold as how you live those values? Because Lynn's story showed us when we align our actions with our values, we don't just change our own lives, we create space for others to live and to thrive and to be amazing human beings. And that's the kind of impact where there's real transformation. So thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of Wendy Cole and me, Lynn Murphy, thank you to our audience for spending this time with us today as we demystify the transgender journey And if today's conversation resonated with you, please pass it on to someone else, share this episode, like, subscribe, help us build our channel, because your support is what's going to help us reach more people and open them up to this learning. And as we always say, until next time, stay curious and stay kind. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Demystifying the Transgender Journey. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode of our fascinating interviews. You can also find more information on our website, thetransgenderjourney.com. So until next time, stay curious and stay kind.